can you reassign your sex to non-binary?
Not in the UK. There's simply no recognition of intersex in UK law. It's kind of like an erasure of personhood. I'm Oscar Davies, otherwise known as non-binary barrister. If you allow someone to go all the way through puberty and go through this process of becoming something that they're not, you're permitting some sort of degrading and almost like torturous treatment.
There is no education, there's no training posts.
There's this lack of knowing where the standard of care is and inevitable breaches of duty of care, or implications that trans people don't deserve a duty of care. Basically denies on an existential level.
I mean, for sure, there are nasty people who are making it very difficult.
Imagine having a legacy based on hate. Who is the real loser at the end of the day? Women, and for what? To protect these hallowed spaces where there's almost no proof of trans people actually attacking them. We know from all of the stats that most of the attacking of women is in the home by people who they know. One of my ideas and kind of arguments is that
Oscar, really, really lovely to have you here. Tell everybody who you are and why you might be sitting in that chair chatting to me.
I'm Oscar Davies, otherwise known as non-binary barrister on socials. I'm a barrister who does discrimination work, in particular focusing on trans rights, although I do all protected characteristics. And I'm interested in how we can push for better rights for people, including all trans people, non-binary recognition, what that may look like, intersex recognition, what that may look like, because we still don't have either of those in the UK, and also removing stigma from trans people for just existing for who they are.
Yeah. So I always talk about trans people, and then you've mentioned the non-binary people and intersex people as well, not having rights in this country. What does that mean in the real world?
So in terms of rights, I think you can separate it between recognition and discrimination rights. And with intersex, there's simply no recognition of intersex in UK law, which is really surprising given internationally there's loads of different types of recognition. So recognition may be having an X on your birth certificate or passport as opposed to an M or an F. But that hasn't happened yet. And there's, to some extent, quite a high degree of small c conservatism within the legislature and the judiciary, I would say, which has perhaps stopped having such progressive basic rights. So that's recognition of intersex. And in terms of recognition of non-binary, there are some cases which say maybe non-binary can fall under gender reassignment, which is Section 7 of the Equality Act, which generally covers most, if not all, trans people. And I use trans in an umbrella sense, with non-binary under it, trans women, trans man, gender fluid, all the other things.
Yeah.
So we don't have recognition for either of those two, which is quite surprising. And then in terms of discrimination, i.e. if someone discriminates against you because you're non-binary or because you're intersex, again, there is no protection there because there's no recognition. So it's kind of like an erasure of personhood. And when there's an erasure of your legal personhood, there's a question as to whether you really have access to your privacy rights, your Article 8 rights. And I've written an article which will come out soon saying you don't really have access to those rights. So how can that be fair or just?
Yeah. So taking it back to a kind of like an easy to understand level. So gender reassignment in the Equality Act means reassigning your sex. Those are the words that they use. So can you reassign your sex from like male on your passport to non-binary? Is that possible? Do you know what I mean?
No, not in the UK. There was an interesting case brought by Christy Ilan Kane, who is an activist and is non-gendered. And that case was basically saying, I want to put an X on my passport because that's what represents me. I don't feel like M, I don't feel like F. And that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court basically said, yes, this is within the scope of your Article 8 rights, Article 8 of the Convention. But it's basically too much of an administrative faff for us to put X's on passports, so we're not going to. And also it said there wasn't enough agreement between signatory states that you should have an X. And so they said the UK was allowed to not have an X. So yeah, we don't have non-binary options on passports or intersex options on passports. So it's simply M or F. Now, people talk a lot about biological reality, which is a phrase that obviously we hear a lot. But I would say that just M and F is so approximative and I would say inaccurate in terms of representing someone's sex and gender. I think it also bears to be mentioned that within the Equality Act and within UK legislation in general, there's quite a lot of conflation between gender and sex. And I suppose that matters because under gender reassignment, it's called gender reassignment, but it says proposes to undergo, is undergoing or has undergone changes, physiological or other, which means it doesn't just have to be a physical surgery to change one's sex. So it's somewhat confusing because with the whole For Women Scotland Supreme Court case, which I'm sure we'll come on to, it doesn't really unpack how that section says you can reassign your sex over to either M or F. But then they say, but you can't. So it doesn't really make sense.
Sorry to interrupt. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching this video. I notice that some of you don't actually subscribe, and it would really help me if you did subscribe, and it will also make sure that you can get my next video if you want to. So just click the button. In my medical training, we did some medical law, and what we were taught was that, okay, you know those kind of hard to read, I find them hard to read, the legislation, you know, those black and white pieces of paper with like 1.1, 1.111, and, you know, they're difficult to understand. And so I get it that someone had to write it and someone had to prove it and someone had to go through that and make that list. And that's what the law is. That is what the absolute basic law is. But then there's, but what did they actually mean by that? What did they mean that the law should do or allow people to do or stop people from doing, you know, the interpretation of that. And that's the bit that gets me, just in that you were just saying then, it's gender reassignment, but then the wording is reassignment of your sex. And then they're like, but no, sex is protected somewhere else in a different characteristic. So I get it. When they wrote it, I think they wrote it, my view is that it was confusing and it's not actually very clear. But what did they mean? And what I feel they meant is that people should be protected and not discriminated against by their sex, their male or femaleness, but also if they have undergone gender reassignment or proposing to undergo, they shouldn't be discriminated against. So why is that so difficult? Am I wrong there? It's like the meaning of the law was to protect people.
Yeah, I think the Equality Act 2010 was combining a load of different versions of discrimination legislation all into one thing. And we have to look at it as protective. The starting point is that no one can discriminate against anyone. And protective characteristics are there to be informative and to attach some sort of discrimination onto. But I think people sometimes misunderstand that protected characteristics are not there to silo people. The protections have always been a baseline of protecting everyone. And then if there is any exceptions, they are extremely rare and extremely small. So I think the gender reassignment stuff is really protecting, in my view, almost anyone who is trans, because it's very broadly drafted. It says proposing to undergo. And the protection is like when something bad happens to you, you should have recourse to justice. So you would have to bring a claim and you would rely on gender reassignment, direct discrimination, indirect harassment, something like this. And then you can get access to justice because you've been wronged in your employment or services or wherever. I think we've come into some sort of perverse position now where people are trying to legitimize some sort of hatred and legitimize separation. But that's not what the Equality Act is there for. The starting point is that the base level is that we should all be equal. If you're not treated equally, then you should have recourse to justice. It's not like this group is better than that group, which is the absurd position that we've come into, which kind of goes against all human rights principles you can think of.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't thought of it that way before. Basically, everybody is protected.
Yeah.
But we've also listed a few characteristics just to watch out for, because it's almost like these are common pitfalls.
Yeah.
So, just watch out for these ones. Don't get caught up in, acceptable discrimination.
Yeah,
against
exactly.
those
And
people.
even going broader than the Equality Act, you have the Protection from Harassment Act. So that's often used in county court, and that doesn't even have to attach to protected characteristics. So that one has to have 2 or more acts, I think, whereas in the Equality Act, it doesn't necessarily.
Yeah.
And so that just shows that harassment doesn't necessarily have to be attached to a protected characteristic, because you could still use the Protection from Harassment Act. But within the Equality Act, it generally does.
Yeah.
That's just how it's been written, because the people who have to rely on them are most often targeted, hence being minorities usually.
Yeah. But in practice, every single day on social media, you see high-flying politicians standing up, denying, for example, trans women as women. We see secondary school teachers in headline news saying that they don't have trans kids in their school. It's just nonsense. We have big celebrities using their large following and saying very unkind things about trans people and other minorities. Is that not harassment? I mean, or what is this harassment thing? Because it seems to me that prejudice and harassment and hate and discrimination is happening everywhere, and nobody seems to be protected.
Yeah, I think social media has been a quite difficult one in terms of harassment, because there are so many keyboard warriors who kind of say what they want. And when you have your freedom of expression rights, i.e. saying what you want, these are not unlimited rights. So in theory, you have your Article 10 rights, which is like, this is me saying what I want to say. Or Article 9, this is my belief and I'm going to say what I want to say. But as soon as that, in theory, as soon as that starts going into harassing territory or infringing the rights of others, then that's no longer permissible, which either means that someone who's receiving that may sue, although trans people unfortunately don't usually have the resources to do so, given this kind of inequality of balance.
Yeah.
Or if the person expressing these maybe offensive or hateful views has been punished at work or something, then they will try and bring a belief claim usually. And then it depends on whether the expression was close to the belief, whether them being fired was proportionate, etc. And that goes into this case story about called Higgs and Farmer. But I think social media is a difficult one because it's kind of like outside of the workplace a lot of the time. It's a bit Wild West, and I don't think the big social media companies necessarily put enough protections in place. In fact, on some, they seem to be removing them. So it feels like there's always a barrage of some sort of harassment. And I think what's a shame is that with the trans stuff, which obviously we get a lot on our social media, there seems to be a kind of like higher threshold of permissible statements and horrible statements. Whereas if the same was done for race, for example, the same wouldn't be, that wouldn't be acceptable.
No.
Either the person would get socially cancelled through a call out or something, or there would be some sort of report to the police, because you can have like a criminal harassment claim, or it would be a civil harassment claim. But civil harassment claims, unfortunately, take quite a lot of money. If you want to bring a defamation claim, that's quite a pricey thing to do. So I think in practice, the difficulty is social media being Wild West, there's like, where's the accountability? And also, do the people who are being harmed have the resources to actually bring a claim against them? And how do they prove what the harm is?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of a combination of reasons.
Yeah. I think, if we were permitting, to use your words, for people to say that black women aren't real women, or tall women aren't real women, or women with disabilities aren't real women, then they would be socially cancelled straight away. It's like, what are you saying? You can't do that. And I can click on your picture and look at you with your nice profile picture with your family. You can't say things like that.
Yeah.
But it's okay to say trans people aren't real, and loudly, and people just kind of walk on by. So I if we can't. And the courts are expensive. The police don't know what to do. It seems to me that regulators don't really know what to do. Schools don't know what to do. Nobody seems to know what to do, including the courts at the moment. So maybe we as a society need to start doing that cancelling bit and saying, excuse me, that's not nice. That's not acceptable. And I wish people did a little bit more of that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent I agree with cancel culture as a matter of cancelling a person outright. I think there's always ways that someone can, improve. And I think it's important to have a degree of compassion in that respect. But I think calling people out can be done and should be done in the right circumstances. If someone says something completely ridiculous to you, I mean, to be honest, sometimes what I do is I'll either leave the comment and let other people comment, or I'll just take a screenshot of the comment and put it on my story and be like, do you think this is acceptable? Because in reality, people reveal themselves for who they truly are in these hideous comments. And so, I mean, I guess, I have a thick skin. I don't really mind that type of harassment because I kind of laugh at it. I think it's ridiculous. But obviously, imagine if you're just like trans woman who's on social media putting up a nice picture or something, and then you get a barrage of hate. Like, it's just so unacceptable. And I think, that there's so many powers at play here which have allowed this to be permissible. You've got the kind of 4 powers. And I suppose from the legal side, you've got the judiciary, which, I have to be careful about criticizing because I'm always in front of judges. But we have these gender critical cases which have come through again and again. And I think that in some ways the wool has been pulled over the judge's eyes in the sense that the belief that's protected is often something like sex is immutable, i.e. sex can't change. But the manifestation of the belief actually goes beyond that. So it usually goes to say something like sex is immutable, and then the implied bit, which the judges don't get most of the time, I would say, is sex is immutable and gender doesn't exist, or you can't change from your sex, or you're just making up whatever gender it is. All of which I would say basically denies on an existential level trans people. And so bit by bit, the judges have protected this belief as being like, oh, it's not that controversial, maybe some people do think that sex can't change. But I actually think that it misses the point. It's like, we're talking about gender here, which is generally speaking how people are treated in society, as opposed to you assume someone's sex, but in a gender sense anyway. So I think there's been a kind of encroachment of that belief being protected under the Equality Act, which in my view goes against the grain of the point of the Equality Act. The Equality Act is there to protect people. So if there's a belief which has an implication or inference which infringes on trans people's rights, then I find it hard to see how that belief should be protected, or any manifestation that's close to that belief should be protected. I wrote an article about it ages ago for New Law Journal called Are the Gender Critical Cases Bad Law? And I got a massive pile on, loads of hate from all the typical actors and loads of random bots and this and that, which was not nice. But, at the same time, you have to call a spade. And at the moment, it seems like gender criticals are calling a bucket a spade, and the judges are like, yes, a bucket is a spade, which is ironic given they say that trans people are doing that.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, there are a very few nasty, well-funded, eloquent, well-spoken people who are making it very difficult for a whole community of people at the moment. And it's very saddening. And the thing that saddens me most is when I see young women coming through with those views, so young, like as young as my daughter. And I'm like, can you imagine if I had spent my parenting time teaching my children this hatred and this division and this prejudice? I wouldn't sleep or turn in my grave. But yet, I mean, I'm sure these young women who think so differently to by far the majority of young people today, where was it they got brainwashed to have those views?
And I mean, imagine having a legacy based on hate. It's awful. And that's why you have to continue to have hope, continue to have faith. The majority of people support trans people. It's only this tiny minority, probably a smaller minority than trans people. I don't know what the stats are exactly, but generally it's 0.5% of the population is trans, perhaps. The percentage of gender critical people, I'm pretty sure, is much lower than that. However, they have very loud voices, but you just have to have faith that in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, that is going to be seen for what it is, which is anti-trans and most often hateful. And I certainly would never want to be associated with that. You know, in many ways, I try to kind of not discuss the gender critical stuff because I don't really want to affirm something which I just think is, you know, like it's a belief that they have, but it's not something which I share or would legitimize at all. But obviously I have to deal with them in court settings and this and that, and that's absolutely fine. But I just think, who is the real loser at the end of the day? Women are, so you're not protecting any women. No. Who are the women who are going to be attacked? Tall women, POC women, gender non-conforming women. And then you also attack an already vulnerable minority, trans people. You are then putting the target on gender non-conforming people. And for what? To protect these hallowed spaces where there's almost no proof of trans people actually attacking them. We know from all of the stats, from rape crisis, etc., that most of the attacking of women is in the home by people who they know. So it's not to say that there's not value in separate or single-sex spaces. Obviously there is. But we have to look at how these lines are delineated. And before the Supreme Court judgment, the case was that, and I remember this because it says it in the 2011 EHRC code, it said that if someone has the if a trans woman has a protected characteristic of gender reassignment, they may use the separate or single sex space. That's how it was. How it is now is it's kind of turned on its head, and the EHRC code, which is still not law, basically says if you're wanting to be have a women's space and a trans women's space, that can no longer rely on the single sex exemptions because it's likely to be discriminatory towards men, which is strange. And yeah, arguably is not necessarily compliant with the law in the GLP and EHRC case. And it also says it might be harassing women. So, you know, how we come to this point, it's strange and obviously sad, but in many ways, you know, trans people will always fight. They always have. And we'll always find a way through. Yeah. It's not necessarily going to be easy, but we'll always find a way through because trans people are some of the strongest people that we know. And discourse and words and legislation, whilst it's important, it doesn't define someone's existence. No. You can't write someone out of existence, no matter how hard you try. And if you do, then history will just call that genocidal or you know, some sort of destruction of some version of humanity. Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you think that people who say they're gender critical, do you think they actually think they're helping women and girls? Or do you think they are just too scared or hating trans people? I think, personally, I think it's the men. I think that they have an aversion, not all of them, but many that I have spoken to. I think they hate the man and they hate the penis and they're scared of it for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And it may be they've had a bad experience in their life. Maybe they've worked with people who've had bad experiences. But I think they're terrified of that man figure and the male genitals. And I think that is all encompassing, and therefore anybody who fits that criteria is scary to them and not allowed near them, and they don't want that near them. They don't want to touch that, and don't want to see that, don't want to be close to it. But then I'm like, but then you look at many trans women who don't look like a typical man, and they don't. It doesn't matter. You don't even know what they've got
under their underwear. But that doesn't seem to matter either. That argument doesn't seem to win. And I actually hate this idea that that people are so scared. We're teaching women and girls to be scared of men. And I'm like, I know that there have been men who've done some damage to women and girls, but that's life. There are some bad people out there who do want to harm, and like you said a minute ago, the by far the majority of those actually are people you know and people in your own home. That's where the damage is going to happen. It's not always on Wimbledon Common. But this idea that we're teaching people to be scared of men, or teaching women and girls to be scared of men, horrifies me. I have 4 sons and a daughter, and the thought that people might be taught to be scared of my sons, I'd be like, what are you talking about? They're not scary people. They're just the best people in the world. And I've also seen women can be very, very harmful. And okay, we don't fight with our fists, but sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. There are many, many women who do that, but we don't kind of see that as scary. So, to coin a nutshell, I think this idea that men are scary and that we're allowing that view, I don't like it.
And I think it also just reinforces patriarchal norms, doesn't it? It implies that, like, prejudice is based off fear mostly. And it implies that if men are scary, men have the power and the upper hand. And, whilst that is probably, we still live in a very heavily patriarchal society, so there's truth in that. But it doesn't, I think that if you're fearing men just because they have a penis or whatever, I think that merely reinforces the subjugation of women as opposed to the opposite. I think, I'm more interested in how we get to a point where we can go beyond sex and gender in a general sense, because I think that once we level out the playing field for, say, men and women in a true meaningful sense, not just in a lip service sense, then we can go beyond kind of gender and sex as a definer, which I think, we know in sports, for example, is not a very good separation, and there's been loads of discourse about that, which I won't go into. But, I think that one of my ideas and kind of arguments is that if non-binary was truly recognized and understood by people, I'm not saying you have to believe in it, but I'm saying, if you understood there was things more than just a sex/gender binary, then I think this would help deconstruct patriarchy in a general sense, would help women, would help gender non-conforming people, and would help level the playing field. But that's such a big ask, and it has to be done incrementally, through legislation, through changing minds, through getting people to get away from this weird Victorian breadwinner separation, which we weirdly find ourselves circling back to. And so, I think it can sound a bit utopian to be like, oh, let's just all go into a genderless society. That sounds maybe not possible, but I do think that there's benefits in kind of conceptualizing things beyond sex and gender. Not to say that they shouldn't be protected, because I think they should, they should still, but do we really need to include sex and gender in most general conversations when it doesn't necessarily, that's not necessarily a factor which is included? No. So, yeah, I think that we're kind of now been trapped by the media into being obsessed in these talking points like toilets, sports, this and that. But for me, that removes the nuance and the beauty in human experience in general. Yeah. And yes, obviously we have to categorize things. We live in a world of words, but do we have to categorize everything as a matter of separation instead of looking at how we can include from the outside in rather than the inside out and leaving the stragglers on the outside?
I really agree. And I think the same applies to sexuality as well. If you're born with XX genitals, you are expected to be attracted to people with XY genitals. And if you're mostly that way, then you just fit in that way, and you're mostly attracted to males, let's say, then you do. And unless you're completely the other way, you don't really enact it. But I kind of think all those young people who are establishing their own identities and their own selves, their own preferences, who they are attracted to, if we didn't have this such high expectation that if you're a woman, you should be attracted to a man, maybe there'd be a lot more fluidity and a lot more fun and a lot more try it out and see what it's like. And, but we don't allow it. And the same with gender. You're going to be a girl. Don't be stupid, of course. But I mean, you're not a boy or a girl. Ridiculous, you know.
I think my next campaign point will be the right to have fun.
That sounds nice.
No, but like, I think, even men, it's important we look at masculinities as well, right? And I think that even men have such a like strong strictures upon who you can be, who you can't be. Masculinity a lot of the time is filled with void and stoicism and emptiness, which I think is so damaging. And I think, maybe men who would want to explore their sexuality more are too scared because they're in this straitjacket, pun not intended, of this sexuality. So I think it works on all sides. And the argument that people raise against trans of being like, well, it's just a feeling, it can't exist. It's like, okay, so are you saying someone's sexuality, which is gay, which is also a feeling, does not exist? Like, how far does this allegation of feeling not representing reality go? And have you actually thought about it? I think that feeling, one's feeling can have reality if your feeling is so strong. So, for example, how do I know that I'm non-binary as opposed to why don't I just believe that I'm non-binary? For me, and it's going to be different for everyone, for me, if you have sex here and gender here, so like M, female, woman, like as far as I know, although I've not done a test, my sex is male and my gender is not there, and it's not there, but it's like somewhere around here. And it kind of fluctuates a bit depending on how I feel. And I know that because there's some sort of disjunct or disconnect between my sex and how I perceive myself or my, I guess, gender. And the way I express that really depends. And to be honest, more and more these days, which I kind of hate to say, but I'll say it anyway, I kind of dress more normcore in a kind of masculine way, just because it feels safer to do so. Like when I was at uni, I was wearing all sorts of crazy things. And I still do my kind of messing with gender when I can, but it feels more dangerous to do so. And so my knowledge of me being non-binary goes deep and innate down to my sense of self. And it's, for me, my perception of myself brain-wise vis-a-vis my body. It's not going to be the same for everyone, but that's how it is. No. So when people try to say gender is merely an ideology, I say it's not. Gender is knowledge. Gender identity is knowledge of the self. And yes, when you're younger, you can be exploring this and, go in different directions. But I'm pretty sure about the knowledge of myself. And how would you know anyway? Yeah. You're not in my head. So the audacity for people to say, you can't possibly know you're non-binary, or it's just a feeling, it doesn't matter. But the fact is, if I say I'm non-binary, and even, when I get a load of hate, like a pile-on, the pile-on is often because I'm non-binary, or people think that I'm not non-binary. So that's already hate based on a feeling, which is then presented in words and becomes a fact. Just a judge, if you bring it back to the law, a judge makes a new legal reality every time they write a judgment.
Yeah.
And guess where that starts from? A judge has to use their judgment, i.e. their feeling based on evidence, and then present it in writing. So for me to make a statement, I'm non-binary, is based on my feeling vis-a-vis my body, vis-a-vis discussions, all the evidence ever. And, why should that not be legit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember one of my favorite stories is a patient that I was with. I think he was about 11, and he was a trans boy, and it was very early on in my learning, and I was in clinic with him and his mum, and they were telling me, him and mum were telling me that he was born a girl, but he's never been a girl. He's always been a boy, and I'm trying to get my head around it and trying to understand it. And he was a beautifully articulate, eloquent, as often are the ones that manage to get through to healthcare. And I was like, but how do you know? Like, what is it that tells you? How do you know? Like, when did you find out? Or what does it mean for you? And I just needed to kind of get it into some kind of comprehension, which he wasn't able to give me because it isn't. And then he just went, Dr. Webberley, what makes you a woman? And I was like, well, I just am.
Yeah, yeah.
How can I put that into words? I just am. And it's nothing to do with my ovaries or my body. It's I am a woman. I just am, And so I was like, you're right, young man. I'm not going to ask that question again because it's just, how do you put that into words? Because there isn't any that fits everyone. Like you say, everyone's experience is different as well.
Exactly. And I mean, I was kind of writing this like biography type thing, and I was talking to my mum, and I was like, oh, when do these things happen, or when do you know? And I think it can be difficult for parents as well to know whether their child is like trans or not, and that's really difficult. But I mean, there was certainly many indications when I was younger. At primary school, I was basically had a group of friends of girls, who were like my best friends. And I remember one of them, we had some sort of argument, and then she said something which really stuck with me. She was like, Oscar, you just want to be a girl anyway. And I remember it really stuck with me because I was like, oh, maybe there's like some degree of reality in that. And the fact is now, like many years later, I've kind of sculpted my body into something which I like. That's not to say that I would never have some, gender affirming surgery or something, but I don't feel like that right now. And it's interesting because it's hard to tell, I think, when you're an adult, whether if the societal stigma was not there and if the access to healthcare was there, whether in the counterfactual, i.e. what I would have done, whether I would have gone down like a more medical transition, I guess. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I think in some ways it doesn't matter. I've managed to negotiate myself and I'm happy with my non-binary self. I think I didn't exactly think that I was a woman, but I definitely had a feeling of not being a man. So, and even now, like when people refer to me as a man and this and that, I kind of wince a bit, which is hard to explain, especially given that I present in a more masculine way these days than I used to. But yeah, it's kind of like the internal monologue versus the external dialogue is quite complicated. And even for me, I'm now 31. Even for me, I'm still discovering, exploring this and that about gender, even though, we both speak on it quite a lot. I would never say that I know everything about it, nor would I say that I know how it feels to be a woman. I have many layers of privilege, which I try to leverage, to be honest, to help other people. But, in society, I'm generally treated as a man, white man with male privilege. There's a kind of nuance in the sense that in spaces where people know me and know the non-binary stuff, they often get that right. And when they don't in other spaces, you have that kind of microaggression, wince type thing, which is quite complicated to explain because people just think, oh, well, you have all the privilege in the world. It's like, no, I have a lot of privilege, but it's still difficult in maybe more subtle ways than it would be for someone more obviously gender non-conforming. But then I take those moments when I can, with my friends, going out, this and that, still, doing makeup, exploring my expressive self, not because I'm trying to put on womanhood as some sort of mask. It's more just like expressing myself as I want to. And sometimes that goes into that realm. If people call that feminine or whatever, so be it. But that's just what I feel like doing. So let me live my life.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because you said earlier something that struck me, and it's in medicine, I think you were saying that all the noise is caught up with toilets and sports and all that, and it cuts away from the real issues, which is just actual inclusivity and equality and acceptance of diversity. And in medicine, we're at the moment so caught up with puberty blockers and everything like that. And I'm like, actually, just shush. What we should be spending our time on in medicine is how do we mentally support people who might be struggling with a big journey ahead of them, and a lot of people to navigate. How do we get care in early enough to stop the body changes that are going to be painful forever and ever? And actually, that if we get that right early, we don't need a lot of the gender-affirming surgeries because we won't need them. And how do we get the best results for the gender-affirming surgeries? Why are we not focusing on that? But we're so caught up on, oh, goodness gracious me, how old should a child be when we give them puberty blockers, and should we let them have them? I'm like, oh, my goodness,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like treating the symptom as opposed to the cause, in the sense that I think with the medical side of things, obviously you know more than me, but my view is that it's like, if you allow someone to go all the way through puberty, and, it's like, say it's a trans woman, on one kind of argument, you can say they were always a trans woman, going back to your earlier point, right? And so essentially you're allowing them to be in the wrong body and go through this process of becoming something that they're not. And for me, it's like, that seems so close to the kind of degrading treatment and almost like torturous treatment. You're permitting some sort of torturous exposition of the self to happen. And I just think, like, if we stop problematizing trans people and start just looking at it like any other kind of issue, or if there's medical stuff involved, then to some extent I think there has to be a degree of pathologization, whether people like it or not, in order to get the things. Debate that somewhere else, I guess. But yeah, I think that in terms of cross-sex hormones and everything else, I think there's so much hysteria about, and integrally it just goes down to, do you believe this child or not? Yes or no? And, as we know with Gillick competence, do they have competence as to the current and long-term impact, that kind of thing? There has to be a degree of understanding. But there's always there's often parental controls in place, as you know, GPs, opinion. And I think now, like, we're in a really scary position where almost no GPs in the country will prescribe gender-affirming hormones to anyone, which I think is going to lead to more deaths of trans people, more mental health issues. And this is not only an issue of the legislature, this is also the medical profession. So, why is there not some sort of guidance on how to deal with trans patients? Yeah. I don't think that, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that exists. And
I mean, this is one of my biggest bugbears is that, so the General Medical Council, who I do have a history with, they are responsible for setting the standards of two things. One is the standards of education. So they need to set the standards. What education should be in place for British doctors so that they can learn and develop the skills and knowledge to treat transgender people. But we don't have those standards of education. There is no education. There's no training. There's no training posts in the Royal College curricula. Transgender people don't exist. So like we were saying right at the beginning, they don't exist. So there's no standards of education, no training, no guidelines, no clinical guidelines. And then there's no standards of care. That's the other thing the GMC is supposed to lay out. This is the standards of care. And they're quite broad to be set out by the GMC. And then they get adopted by NHS and trusts and Royal Colleges and what have you. But there's no standards of care. So everyone is floundering. So doctors who actually want to help their patients are like, am I allowed? Am I going to get get into trouble. And you see it all the time. News, in trouble for helping trans people. And it's like, so doctors, like you say, are going like, well, I'm not doing it then. But we've still got the patients. The patients are still saying, excuse me, hello, can I have some care, please? And the doctor's saying, I don't know how to do that. And it's like, that's not acceptable. What do you mean you don't know how to do that? You're a doctor, for goodness sake. It's like, well, I've never been taught. Well, go and get training. Oh, but there's nowhere to get it from. You know, it's diabolical.
Yeah, and I think you can look at it from a kind of duty of care perspective as well. If you have a trans patient within your wherever constituency, what's the word? I don't know.
Practice area.
GPs, like wherever you are. If you have a trans patient and they say, okay, I think I'm this, I need that, you would obviously give your professional view and then you'd say, okay, we can prescribe you this. However, it seems that more and more there's this kind of lack of knowing where the standard of care is and almost inevitable breaches of duty of care or implications that trans people don't deserve a duty of care, which is, again, dehumanizing and ridiculous. And I think that there are so many different countries who do this in different ways, but it's quite shameful that the UK has fallen to this 22nd place on the rainbow map of ILGA, which I think it's the last European country.
Is it?
I think, yeah. And so, you know, we used to be first on that map. And I think there's a lot of focus on the courts and, you know, the government's position, but there's not much focus on why medically there's so much stigma still around treating trans patients. And I just think that it's like lack of knowledge, but as a doctor, you're meant to have sufficient knowledge. That's why you train for 6+ years. So I just don't really see that to be good enough. And that's just classic institutional transphobia, which is pushing trans people out. You know, if trans people can't get the hormones or whatever treatment they need, they are literally fleeing the country. And I just think that's such a shameful position to be in this country. And yeah, you know, where do we go from here?
Yeah. I want to come back to something that you were saying earlier, which is how long is it going to take to get out of this? And I think you kind of mentioned 50 to 100 years. And I'm like, okay, I definitely hope we're out of it by then. But I think, you know, in the 80s when gay people came out of the closet with their flags and their riots, and they came out and said, we're not putting up with this anymore. I so wish the trans people had come out then too, but they didn't. Okay, that's fine. But if you look at the graphs of when trans people came out, it was about like 2000, between maybe 2010, 15, that's when they started coming out. So I'm like, okay, so in the 80s, it was the gay people, and we're now in 2026 and 45 years. And we're not fully there yet, but that's another story for another day. But I think we can accelerate because we have better access to information and experiences, and we can see real people. We can see that these are not scary people. These are just ordinary people, nothing to see here. We can see, we have education, we have knowledge, we have words, we have the internet, we have social media and the positives of social media. So I'm thinking that we are getting near the end of that bucket and the future's going to be better, quicker than it was for previous groups, I hope.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, not that I'm a mind reader or a fortune teller. I don't have a crystal ball, but my feeling is that I think we need to brace ourselves in the sense of the pendulum hasn't stopped swinging to the right, I think. And I think it will be potentially worse for like another 5 years or so. However, I think during that time as well, as it gets worse and worse, people mobilize more and more seriously. And certainly in my circles, there's been a more serious kind of consideration that we actually need to all work together on this. Whoever is, you know, trying to be progressive / cares about literally basic dignity and human rights. So it should be everyone, but it's not. And so I think that the mobilization has to be stronger. Egos have to be put to one side. Certainly in circles where we are, where egos are very big, it's like, how about we try and get something for this big group as opposed to you individually? And that really annoys me when they're not. But I do think, you know, we need to work collaboratively together and really reveal these this rhetoric for what it is, which is rhetoric, you know, trans people being in danger. No, they're not. You can't rely on an extreme example to make the average. So, you know, people always rely on the Isla, is it Bryce? Anyway, the prison example of like trans women attacking women in prison as the example of trans woman, period. But an example does not make the average. If you were to say that, oh, a fraudulent Jewish person is representative of all Jewish people, therefore all Jewish people are fraudulent, that would be clearly anti-Semitic and people would go up in arms. Yet it's seen as acceptable when you say that about trans people. So I just think these poor arguments need to be revealed for what they are. Where are your stats that say trans people in general are dangerous to society? Where are your stats to say trans people are trying to convert your children? You know, it's just a load of rubbish, to be honest. And I get annoyed because it feels like society as a whole gets tricked by these poor arguments. And I did a Mythbuster series, you know, in December when I was trying to reveal these things for what they are, which is just hot air a lot of the time. But trans people have been pointed at as the villain in quite a strategic and targeted way because certain funders need a target which is not them. So I think that for progress to be made, we need to be more truly collaborative between professions as well. You know, like lawyers need to be speaking to doctors, who need to be speaking to academics, who need to be speaking to politicians, and actually work out how we can maintain the integrity of our equality law system. Because if not, you can be guaranteed that the next people who come will be the gays, will be immigrants, disabled people already having their rights infringed. And I think there's a lot of complacency at the moment, which annoys me because, you know, I studied history before I studied law. And I just know, like, we are not as wise as thinking, oh, history won't repeat itself. But we're wise enough to be complacent that it won't. And then yet again, it does.
Yeah.
And so we really need to work hard in making sure that history doesn't repeat itself with a Section 28, which it kind of is arguably in terms of trans people. But we need to make sure we're able to mobilize and really reveal this injustice for what it is, which is exclusion and serious harm of trans people who, it's like, to me, it's like kicking a dog when it's down. Not to say that trans people aren't fab and amazing, they are. Yeah. But they already are so infringed by so many different societal issues. And I just think it's shameful to hurt someone who is already injured. Yeah. You know, like, not to say that trans people are injured, but in this kind of metaphor, it's like, why are you hurting people who are already being hurt by all other aspects of society? It's inhumane. To be honest.
It is. I think what we need to do is work together. And if we have made mistakes in the past, it's okay to say, okay, I didn't understand it fully. I didn't understand it. I'm sorry if I made some mistakes, but from now on, I really want to work together. So people who have made mistakes, don't worry, it's fine. Let's just work together. And the professions need to work together and educate each other on our different skills and knowledge. And then the public need to come in. And I think the public have heard the stories and they're like, oh my God, that's awful, they're dangerous. And then they're like, well, actually, no, that's not what I'm seeing here. And so again, you know, if the public did used to tell trans jokes or write nasty comments, it's fine. We forgive you. It's fine. But let's work together now. Let's use that new knowledge and that new power to help people. And who doesn't want to be a beautifully diverse community, all of us, who includes everybody and treats everybody as equal? That's just the best of human nature. And I think if we all work together, we get there really quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, you know, for example, doctors could work more with judges and lawyers. This obsession with biological sex is quite an interesting one because there was a case ages ago called Corbett and Corbett, and this kind of defined biological sex as chromosomes, gonads, and something else. And I think that it's less and less clear exactly, you know, what makes it up. But why is a judge trying to work out what it is when a doctor would be much better placed, or a scientist in the area, or whatever. And so in these ways, we can avoid injustices and things like the Supreme Court judgment, which basically said sex is biological sex under the Equality Act, yet didn't define what biological sex is, and left this kind of lacuna for, I mean, I feel so sorry for employers and services, which is a lot of my discrimination work, who are basically left in the lurch. And the EHRC code has tried to clarify that. I think it's done the opposite. But I think, no, in general, I think we can all work together better. We're fighting for humanity, not for inhumanity. We're fighting for inclusion, not exclusion. So let's do it.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with me today.
Thank
and I
you
think
for having
hopefully by people like you and I coming together and sharing our knowledge and experience and just talking like adults talk, maybe we can educate and show the world the beauty of gender diversity and absolutely nothing to be scared of.
Yeah, no, exactly. Gender diversity is fab. Live your life, live your truth.
Yeah.
Be joyful.
Yeah.
Be sad when you want to.
And have the best fun ever.
Exactly.
Yeah, let's do that.
Right to
I
be
love
fun.
that one.
Right to have fun.
Right to have fun. That's
Yeah.
it. Yeah, I'm going to take that one away.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been
Nice
really
to
lovely
meet you,
talking to
Helen.
you. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And don't forget that I write about this all day, every day on my website. Come and have a visit. I'll see you there. Link is below.